There you go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Cartographer office hours meeting. Thank you for joining. This is honestly one of the highlights of the work week for me. I learned a ton from this session, and I hope you can also find it beneficial. Welcome, Scott Rosenberg. Thank you for joining us, and a huge shout out to you. Thank you for helping us on the Tansu TV stream last week. You were so helpful, and we are definitely in depth with you. Thank you, Scott. And
thank you.
welcome.
Great to be here.
Awesome. Let me share my screen for a while. There you go. Okay. Cool. Yeah, some logistics for the session. First, we try to have a voluntary for note taking. So who would like to take note for today's session? I know it's not easy. Like, okay, there's no one.
Guess I can do it again.
Oh man, Marty, thank you. Thank you. Let me add you here. And yeah, please feel free to add yourselves to the attendance list. And yeah, reminder that this, yeah, thank you. The goal of this session is to answer or to discuss questions from the community. But in the current design also, it has a lot to do with discussing improvement ideas for the project in the form of RFCs. So feel free to add any topic or question that you may have. And also we will have today time for discussing RFCs. I don't know if it will be enough. If with 4 RFCs, I'm kind of sure that it won't be enough. So probably we'll end up continuing the conversation during community meeting, right? Okay, without any further ado, let's move to the first topic. I added this in this specific order. If you feel it's not right, just let me know. I put first the RFC process RFC because I've seen a stream of RFCs being open, and I feel that we need first to agree to have consensus on the RFC process itself. So, if you agree, I don't know if Mari would like to introduce this RFC or if there's any additional comment regarding this one.
I think a few people got a chance to approve this out of band asynchronously. There's a lot here, so I don't know that it's worth going into all of it, but in a nutshell, proposes a new RFC template, which just kind of has, which this RFC was written with that template. So a little bit more robust, should make it a little bit easier to read and check on the status of it. And also proposes a process for voting where things go into a draft state, and then there's a process where a discussion happens and then kind of vote to move it into a final comment period, and where by default that'll last for like 7 days, and if nothing changes, no substantial comments are made during that time, then kind of the vote that we had when we vote to move into final comment period, we'll say move it into final comment period with the assumption that it'll be approved if nothing changes or declined if nothing changes. And so if nothing changes, then, you know, it will be approved or rejected based on what we voted. If not, if there are substantial comments in during that period, then we'll reopen it. And I think the vote is a two-thirds supermajority is needed to approve an RFC. A supermajority is based on those who vote. So if you choose to abstain, you're not counted towards the total that 2/3 is off of. So if everyone abstains and only 2 people vote and they vote to approve, that is considered a 2/3 majority because it's a 2/3 of voting members. That's pretty much the gist. There's a lot of words.
I like that last bit. It means that we can just say, I trust people with better knowledge.
Yep. That's actually written straight out somewhere. If you choose to abstain, it's because you trust your peers. So if you have comments, please comment. If you approve, please put, and you're a maintainer, please put an actual check mark on the PR. This is a separate PR I made to implement the other one, assuming if it gets approved, just to give an example of what will be required.
You actually confused me because you put the RFC template in the RFC itself and not in the PR. So I was like, why is he taking them away and not putting in it? I finally worked it out.
I wasn't sure where to put it, but I thought the RFC itself wouldn't be clear enough without an actual template to work off of. So I felt like it needed a template in it.
That's fair.
So yeah.
Thank you, Marty, for writing this down. It looks like several team members are okay with this. If there's any objection or any additional comment, otherwise we could move forward with this one. Okay.
How many maintainers do we have? Do we have a supermajority on this already?
You do, but since there's no, feels like we should have unanimity on this one. And once that process is defined, then we can follow its rules.
We also treat absence as abstinence when people are away on holiday for a couple of weeks.
That's fair. I mean,
I just call that out somewhere if that's all right.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, that makes sense, I guess. Steven, you're one of the people that didn't vote on this RFC yet. Not to call you out.
Yeah, I'll definitely take a look. When are we aiming to approve it?
As soon as possible.
Sounds good. Has James looked at this also yet?
I don't know. I think you mentioned you would chat with James, but if you haven't spoken to him, then it's possible not.
Yeah, I still need to chat with him about it. I like the structure and the rules and things like that. How we approach consensus and deal with like I think this is it should be a really great process for a foundation project, but because it's a VMware internal project, right? I think some of the ways we deal with consensus may need to be a little bit different, if that makes sense. Like, no one should feel like, their manager is, controlling their vote, right? But we still have to account for, how we balance community priorities and, internal priorities.
To me, that just, to be honest, that just sounds like maybe the list of who is a maintainer should change, but not necessarily these rules.
One way or the other. I think it's a thing we should dig more into before we move forward with the kind of consensus thing proposed there.
I would ask that if we're going to hold long on consensus, that we do the rest and treat it as a majority consensus or a greater than 50% or something that's acceptable to you and James, just so that we can move forward with the rest of its niceness.
Makes sense. I don't think it has to take a long time. I just want to sync with James and make sure he's comfortable, if that makes sense, because I know he hasn't seen this and he has a big say.
So on the, James has a big say. I should point out that we have a maintainers file, and neither James Rawlings nor Zach Robinson are currently maintainers of Cartographer. Perhaps that should change. I don't know.
Or does our definition of what a maintainer is change? Do we need more roles, right? I think there's like a there's some questions along those lines that, or we could think more broadly, right?
Sounds like an RFC.
It can be even useful for GitHub on how you can like point a group of people as reviewers of a particular PR. So if we have these different like groups of different kinds of maintainers, maybe that's useful so that like on any RFC we open, we just like add RFC approvers or something like that. So could be useful for the purpose of making our lives easier, asking for reviews.
Thank you all. Anything else for RFC 19? No? Okay, well, next one, and I'm not sure if 18 should go first than 20. But here in the list, it's just first RFC 20, but if you like, Ushuma, I'll let you share your screen and drive this section.
Give me a moment. Bring up. Okay. That actually need to change the titles on these so they match the actual proposal. Yeah, the base motivation is establishing provenance, enabling attestation in Cartographer. We should be able to say, hey, I've got this node in the supply chain graph. I've got this artifact. What were the artifacts that led to this? Or hey, I've got this like to bring it down to the customers of Cartographer. Hey, I've got this code that was running on my cluster at such and such date, and I saw this really bad behavior, and now I need to like know. I need to be able to trace back and see like what was the commit, what was the image. Like I've got to be able to investigate this. Currently, that's not possible. We put inputs into the black boxes, and the black boxes tell us, hey, here's a good output, but it might be an output for an old input. In the RFC, I talk about a scenario that's used throughout the RFC called Resource A. Resource A is a thin facsimile of Runnable or KPack, which both have similar behavior of they will tell you, here's my latest good output, but that latest good output may not represent the most recent inputs that were run against. At the same time, Resource A is able to report ready true, ready false, or ready unknown. And ready unknown is I'm currently doing work. Ready false is I've completed all the work that I have based on the state of the world and the inputs that have been given to me. And the most recent thing that I did failed. And ready true is I've completed all work and the process was successful. It run through some different solutions that could be used to give us attestation and detail why they won't. And I'm happy to describe those or to leave that as an exercise for the reader to go through. But ultimately, the conclusion of those thought experiments was what we have to do is restrict reading the status of objects to when the object has completed reconciling and is in a good state, e.g. when ready is true, then we can read outputs, and we shouldn't read outputs otherwise. There's a lot of other stuff that have dropped in here. I think the two that I would highlight most is we may be concerned about, hey, somebody does 50. Well, actually, let me do this one first. There are some trade-offs. One is in performance. If you drop in n commits all at the same time, but you're committing faster than a given step in your supply chain, the supply chain won't give you a new output until all that has finished. And so that's, that takes a while. The other problem is, what if at the end of those commits, your last commit was unsuccessful? In that case, if it was that 50 commits, the 50th commit is bad, you wouldn't have the output of the 49th commit. Instead, you would have the output of the 0th commit, the commit before any of those started. That's probably not what users would expect. And so this proposes a strategy of keeping a stack of the commits that have come in, and when you're ready to process, keep popping commits off of the stack until you get a good output, at which point you can throw away the stack. Finally, because you're only reading when right now, every time Cartographer reconciles, it's just able to read status off of the objects in the cluster. So when it goes to stamp out a config object, it just read off of an image, and that image output right now is just always good. Like we consider all outputs that have given to us as good. Now we're going to introduce a situation where a lot of the time that image object wouldn't be in a good state, wouldn't be in a readable state. And so we need to make sure that we're caching those. I don't think that's a huge issue because we're talking about caching those values in the artifacts field of the workload as part of RFC 18 anyway. So I think those are all of the big points. Hopefully I haven't gone through them too quickly. Give the floor back to the moderator.
Got it. Any comments around this RFC? Thank you for such a good description, Lucio.
For me, there's some I think larger things around the framing and use cases for the future that we should make sure we're really clear on in the RFC. Like I don't think this is intended to replace attestation, right? Like it's not the tool where you use to prove, this image was really built from this commit and there's a signature somewhere that, right? This is more around visibility and being able to say, from Cartographer's perspective, these are how the inputs and outputs were connected. And I think that, situational awareness, right? I think as Rash put it there in the chat, I think that's an important thing to capture because I think a perspective you could have when you look at this, and this is something like Scott, we chatted a little bit, and you said you're worried about here, is it looks like it's proposing a way of, having a stronger attestation that something was built from something else. And I think it'd be good to avoid that. But I think that those larger questions aside, I think one thing that's missing on the technical side that I wanted to call out, that's I think talked about as an an issue with the synchronization process that's worth looking into is, even if you assume that the conditions are going to be, as described, right? Like ready is, like yes, spec was processed, false is spec was processed and something bad happened, and unknown is, we're not sure. Especially in that unknown case, right? If something got stuck in that, it could halt the entire thing to keep moving. And so instead of looking at it like, I think I kind of brought this up before, instead of looking at it like, hold spec until any change, until there's a resolution and move on, it's more like, that you can achieve traceability, right? If you control spec and you don't make changes to spec, right? And observed generation is, reflect, or status is updated to match observed generation, and a known condition that means that, spec was processed is true. You can make a link between the inputs and outputs. And if you have, I wouldn't jump from there to holding spec until that status is true is the only outcome, because you could do something like, if you're an unknown for a configurable amount of time, right? You need to forget making any kind of traceability or promoting anything forward and wait for the next thing to happen, so that things don't, and I think there are other optimizations you can make in the process that kind of would make sure that the happy paths and the unhappy paths are covered, if that makes sense. I wonder if kind of in the RFC taking the approach of saying, we know that when these conditions are true for, and then do some research and figure out what, third-party resources kind of conform, provide the necessary conditions to do it, right? We can establish this traceability, and then we should capture that traceability. And then maybe some overview of the different, edge cases that could happen there is worth talking about, but I think it says a little too strongly, like we should hold spec until we see status, right? Because I think that implies maybe that we're going to do something stronger than what we need to do just to achieve traceability. It's a little all over the place there. Does that make sense?
I guess well, to pick on one piece that I heard, and we can go on to others. Are you talking about the strategy that ultimately, was what I had been intending to hit or propose was update resources after success, or update resources after completion, and as you said, like, oh, then we should consider some corner cases and see what we get, and I found that was not sufficient. That's laid out here. That if you, and most of these revolve around when, like, what do we do with unknown, and what can we infer when things are in a failed state? Ultimately, success is the only one that tells us, like, oh, things are good based on based on the current state of the world, and it's very difficult to reason about the object isn't telling me that, which old input does the good output that it's giving me relate to? I don't know if you want to dive into this particular corner case, or are we saying that sometimes we'll get traceability, but it's okay if these corner cases we'll be fine if we lose it sometimes?
I think the idea is that we can just give up. The ability is to make it so that we can give up on an input, even if ultimately it ends up that it might have been successful later on, based on like some timeout or some sort of configuration. But just be able to give up so that we can move on to the next thing and like just try our best to resolve the next thing in line.
So I would argue that like handling the next thing, that's the job of the underlying resource. And to be clear, this proposal is Cartographer only reads. There's no limitation to Cartographer in this RFC to updating and to providing new inputs. Every new input that comes, throw that new spec on, update the object, and it's up to the object to have its own. KPack and Runnable actually handle this differently. Runnable will immediately stamp that new thing, and it'll just consider all the things that are in flight, and will tell you here's the latest. Whereas KPack will do that not synchronously, but one at a time. So in terms of timeout, if we want to, we don't need to talk about we need a timeout before we can update. In this proposal, we're always updating. The one thing that we could do is say there should be a timeout where we roll back, where we say oh, this thing's been stuck forever on the 50th commit. Maybe we should try the 49th commit. I think that would be. I don't know if that drives to the underlying.
I thought I read somewhere that we are holding spec updates.
So there's a discussion of could you hold the spec update, and what would be the value? But no, this does not intend to hold spec updates. We can always update.
I thought in the summary it says Cartographer should wait until an input has resulted in success or failure before updating the resource with the new input.
Updating the dependent.
In that case, I need to. If that's the case, I need to update the summary. But this is a proposal. Cartographer can only read the status of an object when the object is completed reconciling and is in a good state. My apologies if, as I said, I kind of
last sentence there. Just so you can see it. Just so you can see it's the last sentence of the summary.
Yeah, sorry. I should. As I said, I had started hoping that this strategy would be sufficient and correct, and it is incorrect. Whereas I argue that this, I think that this one is correct, and I'm hoping to get eyes. I've been super grateful to Scott, for example, coming up with here are scenarios that we need to consider, because I think that's what's really necessary. We need to throw the corner cases at this and figure out is there a correct strategy forward?
So I see both of these options as kind of two sides of the same coin. One is do you optimize for potentially more sort of throughput, or do you optimize for being able to capture more input output matches that are kind of promotable. If you say you're going to hold spec until you see a condition that resolves, then you could slow down the process of promoting things forward, right? Because if you don't do that, if you let spec update, then you kind of introduce the possibility of you have people committing enough to prevent anything from ever moving forward, because you keep updating spec and then a new build triggers and suddenly the previous build isn't promotable because, right? And so, I think it kind of has to be, somewhere in the middle of these things, sort of. I'd say you probably should hold spec, but maybe you shouldn't hold it too long, right? If that makes sense. I think there's a way we can tune this, right, to kind of optimize for the thing in the middle, right, and still get traceability and still not slow things down too much. Although this is a very hard problem, where it's like we're trying to translate a declarative thing, right, into an imperative thing. I'd
encourage everyone to read through areas, because I discuss cases where, for example, Cartographer can only read an update when the object has completed reconciling in a good or a bad state, or Cartographer can only update the object when the object has completed reconciling, but Carta reads continuously. And I detail here's a case where either it would be left unable to do the tracing, or it would surmise incorrectly. Rash?
Yeah, hey, what I see here with this is an implementation that not only will be somewhat complicated in code and complicate the code, as all new features tend to do, but something that will also complicate describing behavior and explaining what's going on in the system, documentation-wise as well. It may also simplify describing some things to people who are used to pipelines, right? You say, oh, we have this output in the workload that will tell you this came from that input, and that might simplify things for people who are trying to understand the system. But it's not very representative of eventually consistent systems, which I'm just wondering, like, is traceability at a high level, is traceability as important as being declarative and like Kate's? And guess what, when you see this state, we can't necessarily tell you where that came from, which run of that previous step caused that to happen, just that it did happen. We've got an output, that's the most resolved one. And right now you've got this state, which is not great. And that maybe perhaps if we show historical context at some point for runs, you know, for inputs, here's an input and it result, and here's an output. Here's a state where things are angry, and this was the input at the time, and that's the best we can tell you, because that's the nature of Kate's and Kate's objects. If that's the best that we can tell you, you do your best to glean what's going on in the system, right? Because we're trying, I feel like, to fight Kate's native behavior. I also think that we could promote the better habit of talking about all of the dependent inputs, including implicit ones, like in KPack, it might be a build image or something, as part of the output, so that an output is actually more complete. But we promote that as members of the industry rather than trying to resolve something for our users right now. I hope that makes sense, but it's just, I'm a little concerned about how complicated this makes things, how it's hard it makes things to explain to people, and how it's a bit of a mishmash of paradigms.
If I could maybe like restate a little bit what I think the goal of that would be, or like the like a plan to, you know, accomplish what we're trying to accomplish without, you know, adding that complexity. We could do things like look at, you know, examine the, you know, image to see if it has a property on it that says what, you know, commit of source code came from, or if you're using runnable, we do know what inputs led into a pipeline, what outputs that pipeline gave. So we have strong traceability there. We don't have to do the translation, and we could use, you know, like things outside of the spec and status value to achieve traceability. And then maybe we could still reflect that in workload status if we wanted to, right? But it would look really different, and sometimes it wouldn't be possible, if that makes sense. And it would be very resource specific. But
Yeah.
but that's definitely an option that we should not, or, you know, we should make sure that that option isn't more viable than adding the complexity of attempting to map spec to status values.
I think we could just do what we do Cartographer does today, because we do that and we do that well, and it works quite well. And instead of shifting paradigms, present what we can know, and even provide a way for template authors to say, this is how you can know the most you can know about this. Like, there's an interface or a contract with a template that a template can, like, we have a way to transform an input into a full spec that we apply. We have a way to transform the results into something as useful as possible without being necessary. So not forcing the nature of the resource that the user chooses to use, the template author chooses to use.
I think sometimes making those associations means you need to like jump resources, right? So like in KPack case, like where we deal strictly in KPack images, right? But under the hood, it creates builds and all that fun stuff. And so if we were to like be able to surface some of those that information alongside the output, it might mean that we end up traversing into some object hierarchy that we don't really know about today.
Mm-hmm.
or demand that object hierarchy might not exist, right? Like there's nothing that says KPAC. We're trying to make this a generic interface, right? And there's nothing that says that KPAC should create builds in the future, could not create builds, and it shouldn't be, something that necessarily breaks Cartographer, right? That really feels like it's dabbling into the implementation detail. So like, I think if you designed an interface here, it shouldn't be something that's built into Cartographer. It would have to be a way to extend Cartographer in a, like another kind of template, or like template properties that let you, just configure how to read information from, other places.
That's literally what I've been proposing for a long time, is that there's a bidirectional templatiness about a template. And that second direction is something that, I feel like one of the things that it can do is also help users know what went wrong better. That's another situation. It's an off-brand, off this topic, but it's sort of for the same reason. We don't know what that resource is going to be, but the template author does. And they may have to get implementation specific, and that may be brittle, but they can say, oh, this thing failed because this thing, when I create this object, there's this real common case where this happens. What I'll tell you is you need to go and check this bit of documentation on how to better configure these inputs.
Is this kind of like observed matches or observed completion, just additional properties in the template that let you observe additional outputs that Cartographer can use? Like observed matches is, instead of doing this observed generation thing, you could just say, like, if you see, if KPAC were to provide the source code commit in its status, then we wouldn't need to do this. We could just observe the other, wait till the other thing in the status matches the thing in the spec, and then we know for sure. Is that the type of thing you're talking about?
Possibly, yeah. I don't know what shape it would be. It needs further investigation. I think there's multiple uses for being able to talk about the state of a resource that got stamped out and echo that upstream again.
Yeah. So like additional outputs is kind of, I'm just making sure I understand right.
Yeah, but I think very specifically not to carry information forward,
right,
to the next resource, because that's very important to me that we keep the shape and simple contracts, right? And so we have simple contracts right now. This RFC feels like the contracts start to get a little bit more messy and hard to understand, whereas we have optional contracts which can strengthen our ability to do traceability and debug, right? I'd love to be able to implement something like that. And this is just spitballing at this point.
I think what's attractive about the current proposal, like with some, I think we need to clarify when we should spec and things like that, right? What's attractive to me about that is that it as long as the external resource implements observed generation, and as long as it's conditioned, it doesn't say, I'm ready when the spec, observed generation is bumped and the spec doesn't match it, right? Which seems like, a contract that a lot of resources, I would hope implement, but maybe don't, right? Like that's something to research. As long as that remains true, then we do have a generic, way of establishing traceability where we could ship a lot of value. We could ship an artifact graph on top of the build graph, right? So, while does that mean we should do both? Or, does that mean that, is it worth pursuing, this, because there are benefits we could get if it means that it adds complexity into our, promotion and movement process? Or like, I'm not saying I have an answer. I just wanted to say, I think to me, it's not clear one or the other.
I know Scott had a lot to say about it. I'd love to find out what he thinks. Sorry, Washima. Sorry, buddy.
I was about to raise my hand. Yeah, I think this is a really good conversation to have. It's a very hard conversation to wrap your head around because there's so much nuance. And also, it depends on nuance of resources that Cartographer is choreographing, of which we don't control, and of which Kate's has no contracts or uniformity. There's some conventions that some resources loosely follow, but do they follow it consistently? No guarantees, like none. Like status is whatever the resource wants to report back out. Taking all that, I think I want to circle back. Words like provenance and attestation, at least in my mind, have a very high bar and have like a very specific meaning and a sense of assurance. And all the chaos under the hood that all the resources that we are choreographing make it very hard for Cartographer to have those assurances. I think it is possible to have a supply chain that does have those attestations, but I'm not sure, and being able to track its provenance, but I'm not sure it's necessarily doing that through Cartographer. And this is me still trying to work out through my mind what all this stuff means. So I think like this is a really good conversation to have, like where it ends up falling between, is this traceability, is this debuggability, is this observability versus is this provenance? Like I think those are different concerns, and we can try to separate them out and maybe address them independently.
Yeah, so one, I think that's totally fair. Obviously the job of Carto is take some input, stick it in a black box, and then what comes out of the black box to move it on. And certainly we can't, somebody could plug in a black box that's just a random number generator, and that's not attestation. The attestation for Cartographer is simply like, I gave black box X, and from X, it gave me Y. And whatever we call that, I'm happy to settle on any term: traceability, attestation, provenance, etc. And certainly, I think that you are correct. Like what we know ends at I gave black box X and I got Y. I think that yeah, and inherently, even in this RFC, there's this there are some assumptions that one, that you can observe and you can determine, like ultimately at some point, this the status of this object represents the spec of this object. Observed generation is a very Kate's native way to let users know that's what's going on, and ready the ready condition status equals true is has a lot of buy-in as well, but ultimately it will be the responsibility of whoever is writing a template to assure that the object that they are creating does give those guarantees, because without them, this strategy would be meaningless. If you bring a badly behaved box, you'll get garbage in, you'll get garbage out, garbage box, garbage out. But I do think that this gives us, yeah. So this one, the other thing I heard, like in terms of certainly in terms of deciding which strategy to use, there's a lot of complication. And in terms of the underlying implementation, there may be some complication, but I think that ultimately the strategy recommended here is, I would argue, very straightforward, and I can explain to someone very, very easily. We stamp out objects. When those objects have completed, are in good state and they're at rest, they're not being reconciled anymore, we pass those values on, and that value will be the value that's passed on until there's a new good object when the object is in rest. The new good output when the object is in rest. And that's about it. Like, wait until things are good and keep passing that good value on until the objects are again in a good restful state. So maybe there's some complication in like making sure people understand what does good and restful state mean. I don't know. Rash.
I believe you're on mute.
Sorry, I don't want to drag this on much longer, but I put a comment in on this one as well, so we can talk about it offline, async. But is it possible to not block outputs, but only add these sources when they're known? So the same implementation, but don't block the outputs. So you'll have sometimes that there are no not known sources, and so be it, because the system was running and you still had valuable stuff. And who's going to get upset that the situational awareness is imperfect, all right? Whereas we're still running, one, in a native way, and two, in a way such that we don't stop us from ever using resources that we can't get this to work for.
Yeah, so really quickly to run through why shouldn't we do that? Let's say that the rule is you can update the object when the object has completed reconciling, but Carto reads continuously. So let's say that Cartographer observes object A is in a ready state, and it submits an update to object's A spec. But at the same time, an instant before, something else changes. So for KPAC, it is the builder, there's a new builder, there's a new image. The object would go into reconcile. It would first be reconciling that update because of the state of the world, and like all objects are merging, some special sauce that they know about the state of the world and the inputs that you've given them. It would first do that state of the world on the old spec. It would report that out. Cartographer, knowing that it hadn't given any update, would assume that that was the result of the spec that it submitted, and it would pass that on with that understanding. That would be incorrect. Yeah, go ahead.
But that assumes that Cartographer would like if the external thing updated, if there's a new build pack and then a build starts right before another spec update happens, and then the spec update happens, the resource is still never going to reach condition ready until both the build pack thing is bumped and a new build is started that completed the new spec, and then condition says ready, and then it's okay to promote. So there's not a problem in that case, right?
Well, I thought that we were saying, can't we drop the read when condition ready and instead use update when condition ready? If the question is, can we add to that? Yes, we can. We can restrict it even more, but we don't need to.
No, I'm not sure that's what maybe that is what I'm saying, but all I was suggesting was that we stay with level change for updating ongoing resources, but we update the source. That is to say, the source in the attestation, right? The source in your workload to the resource. So this artifact, came from this source. We only add that when we can know it using your criteria, right? That's what I'm suggesting. We just leave the current system, but sources are only valid when we can prove they're valid. Otherwise, they're in unknown states. And that way we're telling the truth about what we know and we're using the current system. That's what I meant. But
then you could promote something that you can't visualize. Then you can end up with something that's, actually gets promoted into an environment, but if you're building an artifact tree around it, it's just there's a part missing and there's no.
I was dropping SBOM from this, right? I was talking about the fact that we wouldn't be able to visualize how it got there through the pipeline, but that's the situational awareness thing. The SBOM thing we really ought to solve with SBOMs, which is some way of reading what's in there.
I'm not talking about SBOMs. I'm just like if you have a simple pipeline that has flux and then KPAC and then or maybe flux and then tecton test and then KPAC and then convention service and then it's this in a simple case. If you are willing to promote things forward when you can't achieve traceability because of like a update happened at just the wrong time, right? Then you could end up with an image getting generated from the KPAC resource that you can't tie back to a commit.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I'm saying do best efforts, but face reality rather than.
If you're trying to visualize the whole thing, then you could actually build something at the end that you can't, in the whatever web interface you're building on top of this, see it's traced back. But you could just hold promotion of that thing if you don't have the traceability information, right? Either by not promoting it forward or by holding off on spec updates until it's promotable, until it's resolved, right? Or some combination of those with a timeout, right? And I think that's what Rashuma is proposing.
But I don't think Rash is talking about it. He's not talking about one artifact within the context of something that where this normally works, right? He's talking about a resource where these things just don't hold true at all. Like it's not possible to use this proposal to actually evaluate whether or not something was good.
Oh yes.
It's like
for a resource that doesn't obey observed generation and conditions that match the things.
Well, then I heard something. I thought I heard Rash proposing like, what if we did this, but we just do the like we add tracing when we can add tracing, and when we can't add tracing, we just don't add tracing.
Yes, because I feel like we're walking us into a corner.
Yeah.
I wonder, Rash, if like I would almost do that as like something configurable. To say like maybe so, for example, inner loop. I think this proposal is terrible for the inner loop because you're looking for something that's like just live updating. Sorry, let me back up. Let's imagine you're building a platform, and in that platform, you want to support people having live updates that are going through a supply chain as they code. This is going to just starve their supply chains as they're coding, and they just have to take a break every once in a while, and then it would finally catch up to them. And so making it configurable and they might say like, I don't care about tracing. I'd prefer live updating. Makes sense to me.
I definitely like the idea of making it configurable. I don't like the idea of like just doing best effort for a particular resource where you can like let it run and then just say like, oh, one of these images got certified and then a good one got skipped because we couldn't certify it as it went by. So like, I think we just need to, I think we need to pick a strategy per resource. As long as we can make that guarantee, I think it works.
That's one.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Mari, for reminding the time. We have like 5 minutes now and 2 more RFCs. It's not feasible to discuss that in 5 minutes. I don't know if even introducing RFC 18, it's doable in the amount of time we have, or are we continuing RFC 20 conversation?
I think there's really only, I believe I talked about RFC 18 last week. The only thing that I would highlight now is one small question. I'm hoping this will come up on internet. Actually, it's really a discussion on here. There is there's a question of so workloads are inputs to templates, obviously, and workloads could be changed. And so we want to make sure that we know which workload a particular output, like which version of the workload the output came from. There are 2 strategies that we could use. We could either, one, when the workload spec is changed, just wipe out the status, wipe out the objects that the artifacts that we were tracing, and start again. I argue that only works if we adopt the strategy that's recommended by RFC 20. And you can read the discussion in here. The other alternative is in the from field of the artifact tree, we include the workload spec generation. I'm really agnostic as to which strategy we use. I think both are correct. So yeah, I don't think we have time to discuss. Well, I don't know. Floor's open. Thoughts?
Any thoughts yeah, we already discussed this RFC last week. And there were some updates, I believe, during this week. So I don't know if there's any additional comment from the team.
Kind of unrelated. I actually don't have an opinion on which one we pick. I'm totally agnostic to either option. I just want to mention also that I think we could probably move forward with 18 without 20. Also, if we take artifacts to not mean that they came from a specific previous artifact, but we just draw the artifact graph of the latest of every artifact, and then take the from field to mean it came from an underlying resource. So that's not a great way of putting that. Basically, just instead of like actually associating an artifact with a generation, if we didn't have 20, then we could still draw out our artifact graph, but just have all the artifacts being represented by the latest artifact.
Yeah, we would maybe hash this part of past and have that be the ID that's here.
Or even have it still, even have the syntax be the exact same, and just take from to mean that it came from the resource identified in past, right? And then we would still be able to build the graph. We would still be able to like show all the different artifacts, but the things that we draw are just always the most recent from everything.
But then we have an artifact graph that looks like it's talking about the relationship between artifacts, but it's actually talking about the relationship between the jobs, and then it has artifact names in all the places.
It would actually be an artifact graph that shows the relationship between the resources, right?
It seems like it's an artifact graph that's wrong then.
I mean, I guess that, like, my point is, it wouldn't be an artifact graph at that point. It would be the latest outputs from all the resources, which I still think can be valuable, right? It just doesn't solve traceability.
Why not just cut from, right, and then move that? I'm just trying to, from my understanding, like, why not just cut from and move it to RFC 20? Why have a from field that's wrong in RFC 18 instead of just adding a from field that's right in the next one? Is there some use for that I'm not catching?
Because then you can't draw a picture, right? Because then just by looking at the workload status, you don't know that, like, you can't draw the graph because you have no.
You can
have to look up the object graph separately.
But you can draw the graph in the workload spec, right?
You can draw the graph of objects in the cluster based on some owner reference field, right?
But that would be the same as the artifact graph if the artifact graph didn't have connections between the artifacts. It's just the same as the resource graph, right?
Yes, that's totally true. You can do that, right? I'm just saying, if you keep the from field and draw it as a resource graph, then later, once we add RFC 20, then we can get a better certification of the resources are actually, like, caused by specific artifacts rather than just related. We can show that these objects are related right now without RFC 20, and later we can show that they're caused by other artifacts once we have RFC 20.
But you're going to get this thing in the status, and you're going to go source revision is this, and you look at from and see the ID, and then go to the other thing, and then look at source revision, and it's going to be one that didn't actually lead to the creation of the other one, right? It seems like we wouldn't want to
think about it as. I mean, I don't. Yeah, that's fine. That's my point is that it's not, your from field no longer represents the relationship between artifacts. It's like, you think of it as the relationship between resources, and that resource is producing this as your latest artifact. Anyway, it's probably like, I'll add a comment or something, because I think it could still be valuable, and it might unblock us on RFC 18.
let's
Yeah.
dig in more. Sorry.
Wrong. Yeah, at this point, I believe we will need to keep the conversation async, at least regarding RFC 18. And also, Raj, for the multiple paths RFC, do you think we could discuss that on next office hour session 1 week from now, or is it something that we'll need to discuss this week?
If you all could give me just 3 minutes, I will show you what it is and you can talk about it offline. It still needs work, but if I could just visualize it real quick for you now, it means that I can start getting some feedback on it, and that would be really helpful. Is that okay?
It's okay.
Right. So Washima introduced an RFC. I don't remember what version it was, but in his RFC, it is possible to have multiple templates, even different ones, for a specific resource, and choose them based on field and label selection. So a classic example might be that you have a GitOps step at the end, and if there was a label or something that told you how you wanted to push your resources up for GitOps, that it would choose a different template. And then in extension to that RFC, I would like to propose that one of the other selectors that we can use is inputs availability. So in the case of like, while we're doing a config, to like maybe run to generate the configuration for a deployment, that we can select which template to apply based on whether any upstream input would be satisfied. So in the case of configure here, if the source that was provided was actual source, and there is hidden matches here, this would look to see if there is a field for spec source URL or spec source image. This one here chooses to run simply because it says has test, but it could also just be based on the fact that has test true, that this is the only way to select for tests at the moment. But then the image builder could decide whether to use the source tester as its input or the source provider based on whether this input's available or not. And there are contentions that we have. So we propose that this is a priority list of the options that's already there in his current spec. So it would pick this build image if for any reason we believe source tester would be built. This would require us to build the tree, but it's pretty straightforward to shake the tree. And same with configure here. Now it decides I will use the image provider because the selector for image from image registry was spec image. So this would be selected. So it would be configure. If it was spec source URL, then it would probably be one of these two. It would use this. I've already done some empirical tests to make sure that all of the logic behind this flows and that it can be analyzed. I'm happy to do some more, but I thought I'd just introduce it so that folks see what it is that I was trying to achieve with that. It is the ability to run the same template or a different template for the same sort of resource step, depending on inputs, not just fields. And it would be an ANDing of inputs and fields for each one. Spec shows you an example of what it looks like in the RFC.
Awesome. Thank you, Rush. Thank you all. Okay, that's it. See you on community meeting on Wednesday, and thank you for your time. Bye.